Hi, everybody. On behalf of LAist and LAist Studios, welcome to the first of two virtual events with our podcast, Norco 80, The Aftermath. Today, we'll dig into prepping and survivalism. Next week, we'll be back to look at the pervasiveness of gun culture and the militarization of the police force. Hi, I'm John Cohen, and I manage live programming and events for KPCC and LAist. And while we look forward to the eventual return to in-person events, we're pleased you've joined us today online for this and other virtual events. Today, we invite you to engage with us and your fellow attendees in the chat section, where you can also ask questions of our program participants. For folks who are not able to join us today, or for those of you that may want to go back and watch again, the video of today's event will be available on the same page you're watching it now. The transcript will also be available after the event. To check out other LAist events, LAist Studios podcasts, or to subscribe to our newsletter, please go to laist.com. If you're in a position in which you can support LAist, we're always grateful for anything you can do. Just go to support.laist.com/events. Thank you again for joining us today. Without further ado, LAist Studios executive producer and Norco 80 host and producer, Antonia Cerejido.
Hi, John. Thanks so much for the lovely intro. I'm Antonia Cerejido, was the host of Norco 80, and I'm really excited for tonight's event. It's going to be about preppers, prepper culture today, and sort of more of the more recent history, which I think is a topic that's really interesting. And so I'd like to introduce our first guest, Paige Ferrari, who is a former producer on National Geographic's Doomsday Preppers. I think, like, for many people, is an introduction to prepper culture was that TV show. And also Brad Garrett, who is the author of Bunker: Building for the End Times. Paige and Brad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And so, Brad, you when I reached out to you, you told me that you actually have a personal relationship to Norco, the city.
Yeah, strangely enough, I grew up in Riverside, California, right next to Norco, and we always thought of Norco as Horsetown. That was the place we went when we were kids to sort of hide out in the orange groves and go ride horses. It felt like a world away from LA, but also a world away from the Inland Empire. There was a lot of sort of tension in those days, the 80s and 90s, with sort of people moving to the Inland Empire and gentrification and sprawl, and people in Norco trying to retain a rural lifestyle, keeping their land, keeping their horses, building bunkers. It was a very interesting place to grow up. But yeah, Norco was sort of it was kind of a rural oasis within the sprawl of Southern California.
It's really good to hear you saying that, also because one of the crazy things is that we thought we'd be doing a lot of this podcast in person, but the pandemic hit. And so we didn't actually get to meet the horses of Norco. So it's good to get another firsthand account. But you didn't know about the robbery when you were growing up. Had you heard of it?
Well, so I was born in 1981, and it was a year after the robbery. So yeah, it wasn't really it wasn't on my radar. The memories that I have of Norco are of tack shops and horse parades. They had this down the main street in Norco. They have this amazing parade every year where people bring out their horses and the fire department brings down their fire engines. It feels like a very rural affair.
That's so fun, yeah.
But yeah, I didn't know about the robbery. I mean, I feel like as we moved through the 80s and the Inland Empire became this sort of like, battleground of gentrification, a lot of that maybe was buried to history. So it was really a pleasure for me to listen to the podcast and sort of fill in my own personal history through it.
That's awesome. And Paige, you started working on National Geographic's Doomsday Preppers in 2010, 2011?
I think it must have been 2011 when I started.
And did you know a lot about preppers before working on that show?
I didn't know anything. I didn't know what the word prepper meant, and I didn't know any of the terminology. But once I started out, it seemed strangely familiar to me. And I think that's because I'm from Central Valley, California. I'm from a town called Turlock, which is probably not that different from Norco in the sense that it's very much this rural oasis. So as I started to meet these preppers and cast them for the show, I was like, oh, I kind of know you. I kind of know you. You remind me of someone I know.
How does the casting on a show like that work?
Well, for that show, it was really challenging because I'm sure, as Brad could tell you, one of the central tenets of prepping is operational security, OPSEC. So the last thing a real prepper would want to do is take my call and go on National Geographic showing their preps. So it was kind of like a seduction. We would go to conferences, we would go on message boards and just kind of start these conversations, which were usually me sort of like asking just to see a little bit of the preps and then a little bit more and slowly kind of building a relationship where they trusted us.
I mean, watching the show, though, you do get the impression that the people who do share are like very excited to share.
Well, I think we were helped by something I found to be like a paradox at the center of prepping, which is that you're not supposed to tell anybody about what you're doing, but it costs a ton of money. It takes a ton of time. And for many people, it is their pride and joy. So like sort of like some of the, I would say like a real prepper, you have to prepare to be denied 3 to 5 times. Like they'll hang up on you, they'll call you a government agent, they'll post your emails on the forums. And then like 3 days later, they'll be like, would you like to see my bunker?
That's awesome. Yeah, so you sent me, let's start off with a little bit of the show. You sent me some of your most memorable clips from the show. And so this first one is a clip of a man named Martin Colville. And I wanted to start with this clip because I think it really kind of illustrates like where the country was when you started shooting the show.
After the 2008 economic crash, Martin and Sarah were among the many millions of Americans who lost their home to foreclosure. Their big rig truck was all they had left.
Hi, welcome to our home.
They now live and prep out of its 53 square foot sleeper cab, the size of most Americans' master closet.
Since our home is mobile, we can't carry as much as you might store at your own home.
I've got stuff stashed just about everywhere I can stash it in here. A little bit of dog food. After the collapse, there's not gonna be factories. I'm gonna be able to make clothes. Could make a shirt for Marty out of the camel. I have a stash of dry food. I have 2 layers of it behind this cabinet.
Dehydrated food not only lasts longer, it is 2 to 4 times lighter than fresh or canned supplies, making it an ideal food source for the mobile prepper.
Yeah, so Martin talks about the 2008 financial crisis. I'm curious for both of you, what do you think that moment, how did that impact the prepper community?
Well, I'll go ahead and just quickly speak about Martin. I mean, as you heard from the story, that was the basis for him kind of becoming a full-time mobile prepper. And for many of the preppers we talked to, that was just a huge, I mean, there are several events. I would say Katrina was one of them. Y2K was an early one, September 11th, but 2008 was the big one for sort of deciding that they needed to kind of take their safety into their own hands and they couldn't really trust the systems anymore.
Yeah, that's precisely what I encountered as well when I spoke to preppers for my book. People told me that, we used to live in a state of security that was provided by the government. And now that we've moved into a kind of more neoliberal environment where more trust is being put in private markets and corporations, that people didn't feel that they could trust the state to take care of them, and they certainly couldn't turn to corporations to take care of them in the event of a disaster. And so it's kind of, it feels like something new, but it's actually a return. This is the way that Americans imagine we used to live, right? That we would live off the land, we would be self-sufficient. So there is a kind of, frontier fantasy attached to this as well. But I think it's also a realization of the realities of the world that we live in now, as the social safety net has been sort of hacked away over the years. People feel more of a sense that they need to take responsibility for their for their own safety.
And it's Martin obviously is an example of somebody who was prepping not in later in we're going to see clips of people who, you know, perhaps have more money, who prep in a more like luxurious way. You know, like, what did you feel was the demographic breakdown during both of your times? Did you feel like most preppers were of a certain class or background?
I mean, Brad probably can speak more broadly than I can, but I would say one of the surprises that I found when I started talking to so many preppers is that prepping is really expensive. This is not, you know, this is not a poor man's activity. And just to find out like how much money and how much luxury, as you said, could be poured into prepping was kind of a surprise to me.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. But I was also kind of surprised that, I mean, in terms of the demographics of preppers, I was surprised by how diverse the community was. And I have to admit that I made an attempt to reach out to diverse communities in the course of this, but I found them over and over again. And often what I found was that people who had grown up in difficult conditions, you know, they took prepping seriously because they had experienced adversity. They knew what it felt like. There's some amazing research that came out in the last couple of years by Anna Maria Bounds, a researcher in New York, and she worked with urban prepper communities. And a lot of them, what they had said is that after going through particular events, you know, Sandy, Katrina, you know, experiencing what it feels like to be without water or power for a long time, and then sort of correlating that with their childhoods where they had experienced these kind of everyday emergencies of having to deal with crises. You know, that was a trigger for them to take it upon themselves to begin to prep. So, I mean, you know, I'm sure at some point we'll talk about how prepping has changed over the years, but one of the things that I find really striking is that, yes, there are these people who are building, you know, multi-million-dollar bunkers. There's also a lot of people who have made a decision that rather than buying, you know, a second house or a boat, these are the kind of upper middle class preppers, they're going to invest in the bunker. But there's a lot of people who are just prepping for kind of everyday emergencies. We call it practical prepping, low level prepping. You know, people who are preparing to just make it through 3 days without any kind of state intervention. And that demographic has exploded in the past decade.
Well, one thing that you from your book that surprised me, Brad, is that you wrote that 40% of people in the U.S. believe that stocking up on supplies or building a bomb shelter is a wiser investment than saving for retirement. I find that to be pretty surprising. Yeah.
Well, this comes back to the financial crisis, right? If you had a 401k or you had, you know, you had stocks, you had savings, and you watched those evaporate during the financial crisis, then you start thinking about your future security in material terms rather than in economic terms, which, you know, increasingly looks to be very speculative and nebulous. You know, you feel like those things can disappear, and that comes back to the kind of the social safety net disappearing, right? So I think a lot of people have turned to you know, creating a kind of material backup, whether that's having a backup generator or storing extra food or whatever it might be, to give them a sense of security that the numbers in their bank account or retirement account don't necessarily give them. Mm-hmm. And you know, that makes sense as, you know, precarity increases, that people are going to look to their material surroundings, you know, the land they have, what they can store, what they can build, what they can make, as a marker of how they're going to be able to weather crises in the future.
Yeah. I don't know, I was going to add, I don't know if you saw this, Brad, but with Martin, one thing that really stood out to me is that he had experienced like precarity in his life before, obviously, but, you know, very kind of late in the interview process, he revealed to us that his wife, who was prepping on the road with him, also had cancer, and they were trying to keep up with medical bills. And so in a way, their prepping activities gave them also control over, or a way to control their thoughts of the future or what they could face next, even though they were facing something really scary right in the here and now.
Right.
Yeah, that's absolutely something I found with the people that I interviewed, that The world to many of these preppers feels like it's increasingly out of their control. The existential threats that we faced during the Cold War, for instance, when we were thinking about nuclear war, speculative disaster, have been exacerbated by climate change, by economic precarity, by fears of artificial intelligence, all sorts of things that people are worried about. And so I think just on purely psychological terms, it's a natural human reaction to think, well, I'm going to take control of what's around me because I can't control those things out there. So I write about the bunkers that people build and the spaces that are being created by this atmosphere as the architecture of dread, because it feels to me that as people are instilled with more of a sense of dread. I mean, I live in the mountains, and I'm constantly thinking about wildfires. Like at any moment, I'm waiting for one now. We had a year ago. I was sitting here and I was breathing ash through this window. We're constantly waiting for something bad to happen, and it's part of that is because of our media consumption, because we're aware of disasters taking place all over the world in a way that we wouldn't have been a few decades ago. But a lot of that we also have to realize is very real. The frequency and severity of natural disasters, for instance, is increasing every year. And it's a perfectly rational response to that to think, well, I can't control the climate crisis, for instance, but I can control whether I can evacuate if a fire is coming up this mountain. And I've certainly taken that message seriously in the years that I've begun working with preppers.
I think that leads well, sort of the architecture of dread over time leads very well into our next clip of Ed and Diane Peden.
I am preparing to survive and thrive underground. We live in a decommissioned Atlas E missile site somewhere west of Topeka, Kansas. It's a very large underground hardened structure. Keeps us very safe from lots of things.
Ed originally chose his home because he feared America would be attacked from above.
I first saw this site in 1982. Ronald Reagan was then president, and it seemed to me that nuclear exchange was a real possibility.
These days, he thinks there's another ground-level threat that's more likely.
The economy is certainly in trouble. In some ways, the economy has already collapsed. And everybody thought the economy was just going to bounce back. It was just a little recession. Well, that hasn't happened. It's not happening. There's going to be desperation, and there's going to be potential violence.
So, Paige, any juicy background detail on how you got Diane and Ed? I mean, that is quite the underground bunker. Yeah.
Diane and Ed are like a special elite kind of prepper, I think, just because of that Atlas missile silo, which I just looked it up the other day because I was kind of reminiscing. I believe they bought it for $42,000 back in the day, and it's on the market for $3.4 million.
Oh my gosh.
Currently that I saw. So I guess they did something right. They were really interesting. They were very, very difficult to get. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure they loved us. I'm not sure they loved us coming into their bunker. They represent we wanted to show them because they're a very different type of prepper than you might expect, right? They're not super right-wing, militia-minded people. They're actually kind of a peace and love 1960s communal movement. And at one point, our field producer there called me because they were all like in the hot tub together after the shoot, and she was trying to get them to sign releases. And it was very difficult because they did not wish to sign our releases and sign them with like the names of Hindu deities and other things. So wow. That was a crazy shoot, but what an amazing space, and like really fascinating, cool people.
So did they live there with other people too, or it was just them?
It was just them full time, but they definitely had a community kind of spread through that area. and they would come there. And, they basically were kind of like a healing circle, a drum circle. A lot of them would share food that they grew with each other, or healing advice. So they were just a kind of a hippy dippy prepper community.
That is fascinating. I love the zoom in at the beginning where I don't know what she's doing, but that's a really great shot.
I really love, it's been a long time. I just love that shot of Ed in the tunnel.
Yeah, no, definitely there was like a lot of fun artistic things happening there. I mean, it's interesting. You hear him talk about how he started prepping for one reason and now has completely changed his reason. So I'm wondering, Brad, if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I mean, first I would say that that couple is a great indication of how diverse prepping is. You do find that there's a stereotype about prepping that comes from survivalism, that these are sort of, lone wolf, white, middle-aged men, with some resources who are bitter and jaded. And actually, the more time you spend in prepping communities, you find that they are communities, right? They're community minded. And many preppers are concerned about taking care of their neighbors as well as themselves and their families. So I think, it's important to kind of disrupt some of that narrative. But yeah, the motivations for prepping have expanded exponentially over the years. And most preppers that I spoke to weren't necessarily prepping for any specific event. They were trying to prep for a range of events. And that's very difficult to do, right? Because if you're prepping for 14 days underground, waiting out nuclear fallout, that's a very different preparation than prepping for an electromagnetic pulse that's going to wipe out all of your electronic systems, right?
Can you actually, there in the show, there was somebody else who also was afraid of an EMP. And I don't think can you explain that a little bit more, what that is?
Yeah, okay. So an EMP is, there are two ways that they could be produced primarily. So one is through a coronal mass ejection. This happens naturally. The sun every once in a while just sort of burps plasma, and you get these big electromagnetic interferences that hit the Earth's atmosphere. There was a very famous event in the 1800s called the Carrington event, which took place and it magnetically charged the ionosphere over the Earth, and it fried all of the telegraph lines across Canada. People in New York City were reading the paper by the Northern Lights or by the Borealis, right? I mean, the atmosphere was supercharged. So that's one way this could happen. The other way it could happen is through a high altitude explosion of an atomic device. So, that would actually be much more damaging than a direct hit, and it's much easier to unleash. And the US government has been quite concerned over the past decade about the possibility of an EMP. And, if you think about what that did to telegraph lines in the 1800s, imagine what it would do today to all of our electronics. And so
how are people prepping for an EMP?
Well, so they build Faraday cages, which is it's a cage that will it's a cage that will shield an EMP. I know all this stuff. Yeah, all this stuff.
A specific cage. Okay, cool.
Yeah, but you can actually build one. I watched a guy at a conference I went to, PrepperCon. I watched a guy build this out of a trash can, a yoga mat, and some duct tape. He built a little Faraday cage so that you could stuff your electronics into it and protect them from an explosion.
Your microwave could be one. You could put them in your microwave if they're small enough, right?
Yeah. But people also, there's a resurgence in people buying vehicles that are that don't have electronic components. So I've got a 1972 GMC truck sitting outside, which, if an EMP were to smack that, I could easily replace some components and be back on the road. But there's kind of a resurgence in oldies car buying by preppers who want to have something that they can sort of repair in the event of an EMP.
Awesome. I would, if it happened, I would hope I'd be close to you. Well,
but how far do you get, if there's no fuel?
Right.
You could wrap all your things in tinfoil if you just want like a really makeshift one. Your most essential electronics, right, Brad? You just wrap them up.
You can.
You can't wrap your
I mean,
car in tinfoil, though.
you can't
Try
wrap
as you
your car in
might.
tinfoil. Yeah, but it's, I mean, the thing is, but getting back to your question, so you think about these events, what could happen, what might happen. And once you start speculating about a whole range of disasters, the way that you prep for those becomes quite complicated. And it looks crazy to other people, but it is based on science in many cases, and it is quite rational response to what might take place.
I did say this in the podcast. I have like prepper tendencies. I have a rooftop like urban garden, and actually this has been a very hard week for me because I spent months growing tomato seedlings, and this group of starlings like ate all of them. I know, I was really upset. I was like up on my roof like chasing after these birds. So I understand the pride part too. Like Paige, you were talking earlier about like, I'm very I was really excited for those tomatoes, and I'm very upset about this. But speaking of things that are people's pride, let's play a second clip of Eden and Diane.
I didn't think I could live underground because I really enjoy light, the sunlight.
The Pedens relieve the stresses of subterranean living in their own way. This jacuzzi, which Ed and Diana installed in 2000.
Our hot tub here is not just about surviving. This is about thriving, and we love it. We don't get in the hot tub with suits because the laundry never rinses thoroughly.
Nobody seems to mind.
Nobody seems to mind.
I mean, you gotta love a luxury survivalist jacuzzi. I really love that. And in general, like the idea of like luxury and survivalism is very interesting to me. Brad, you wrote that you went to a luxury eco forest in Chiang Mai. So I'm curious, what was that experience like?
Yeah, it was kind of incredible. It was a Canadian who had moved to Thailand. He fell in love with someone he met at a video store, and he moved to Thailand, and he worked on oil rigs. And so he was sort of offshore for 2-3 months at a time. And he started reading these news stories about home abductions and murders and terrible things, and was concerned about his family. So he started moving into more and more fortified compounds, and then eventually at some point decided they were just going to build a bunker because land was inexpensive and construction was cheap. And I went to see the bunker. It was just outside of Chiang Mai, and it was an incredible thing. It was a kind of in a very rural location, and he had built this sort of block fortress that had no windows on the bottom floor. It had sort of traps, so if you got through, the front gate, you could be trapped between the gate and the front door. Very advanced surveillance systems. But once you got into the building, it was open air to the outside, and it had sunlight streaming through and fruit vines, passion fruit growing from the walls. There was a pool that was sort of sun drenched, and it was glass lined, and underneath the pool was a nuclear fallout shelter that was that doubled as a day spa.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, it was an absolutely amazing space. And then it was totally off the grid. He was operating on solar, had dug septic tanks and they had their own water source. And when you went up to the roof where the solar panels were, you could see in the distance a Buddhist temple, and there was a 50-foot or 50-foot tall gold Buddha that could be seen from the roof. And one of the things that always surprised me about the preppers that I met is that they were very calm. I expected them to be anxious people, right? But he felt that he had taken things into his own hands. He had preparations in place. They had built this place that was, as Ed said, where they wouldn't just survive but thrive. And it was his little piece of utopia, and his family was perfectly happy there. It was a really amazing thing to find. The villagers who lived around it in a very different kind of house
Yeah.
were not very happy about the bunker being built there. but for him and his family, it felt like the right thing to do, and he followed through on his vision.
Did you talk to him about how the villagers felt?
I did, yeah, and he said, I talked to him about it in the context of security, because as Paige mentioned, it's very, it's hard to get access to these communities, and you also don't want to disrespect what they're doing, right? And so I pitched it in the context of security, and I said, look, if something were to go wrong, wouldn't you want to be able to depend on your neighbors, to call on them, to trade with them, to hunker down as a community? You don't really want to lock yourself in this building, right? And he told me, you know what, you're absolutely right. And a couple of months later, after I had left, he sent me a message and said that he threw a massive party inside the fortress for all of the community, invited everyone in. Yeah. So this is one of the great things about research, right? And whether you're shooting a documentary or whether you're doing ethnographic research, if you spend time with communities, you don't just see what they're doing, you become a part of the story. And I always saw my time in these communities as an opportunity to sort of, open up different possibilities about what they might do with those spaces.
That's amazing. Paige, did you think about like the luxury aspect of the prepper movement? Did you maybe at PrepperCon, not just in people's own homes?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there was a spread, but like certainly some people were on the luxury end, and that kind of is or was at the time sort of a motto within the communities. It was like, we're not surviving, we're thriving, and you would hear that all the time in different ways. And I would say, like, I wouldn't say this was everyone, because some preppers were like a little more intense and a little more scary, but like there was like a certain joy to a lot of it, which I don't think I expected either. It was like joyful and fun for them to show us these things. It was kind of like, finally someone gets to see this thing I've put my heart and soul into.
Mm-hmm. No, Brad, what you said, Brad, about the calmness does surprise me. That's a really interesting note. So now we're going to transition to someone who I don't think I would describe as calm, and I don't think, Paige, you would either. Our final clips are from a man named Tim Ralston, and something crazy is going to happen to him in this episode. But first, we're going to play a clip where he talks about his invention, the Crowball.
I do consider myself a prepper entrepreneur. James, have you seen this done before?
Tim and his business partners, James and Nick, have made a career from inventing survival tools that they believe will give them an edge in the apocalypse.
When we invent the product, we're thinking honestly of ourselves and our families and what we need to do if there's going to be an EMP attack. Cool.
Today, one of their latest inventions has arrived back from the manufacturer.
Nice. Gentlemen, Crowball meeting.
It's called the Crowball.
I came up with the idea for the Crowball when I was repacking all my bags. It's taking 13 different tools that weigh about 45 pounds into one tool, and it only weighs 5 pounds. And it only weighs 5 pounds. And it only weighs 5 pounds.
So maybe first you want to tell us a little bit more about Tim Ralston and how you found him, Paige.
So Tim Ralston, I think, as he even said himself, we saw him as our entrepreneur prepper, and he certainly was. And the Crowball was his invention. He brought Crowballs to the office, which having those things around seems pretty dangerous now in retrospect. But like a lot of prepper inventions, it's like, it's linked to something that someone might carry in the military. It's like a lightweight all-purpose tool, but then it has this overlay of sort of machismo and kind of fun to it. It's like you can kill zombies with it. You can open your beer with it. So he was one of the people who was very excited to be on the show because, and he was lovely and fun, but he had something to sell.
The Crowball. Yeah.
The Crowball, yeah.
Yeah. Brad, did you come across a lot of entrepreneurial preppers?
So the people who were clearly selling things that I met, usually they were selling bunkers themselves or selling space in communities. In my book, I call them the dread merchants, because they were kind of, you know, that dread that I spoke about earlier that people felt about, you know, the potential of the future falling apart in various ways. You know, they would capitalize on that, right? They would prey on people's fears. They would tell people the world is getting worse. You know, if you don't invest now, you're going to be in trouble. And I made a very clear effort to sort of cleave them from the people who were moving into those communities. And a lot of those people that were moving into the communities, yes, they were buying security, but often that security was like an empty concrete shell, you know, in the middle of a prairie somewhere, or, you know, space in a silo. And what I often found was that those people were incredible. They had incredible minds for engineering, creativity, innovation. I watched one of the preppers that I worked with. He realized that he couldn't wash his clothes after we were in the bunker for about a week, and so he got a 5-gallon bucket and a plunger and drilled a hole in the lid and made a washing machine. And wow. he washed everyone's clothes. It was fantastic. And I found out later that he was a mechanical engineer. So he had a mind for this kind of thing. So yeah, I ran into a lot of people that had incredible visions for what they were going to build. But I was most impressed with the residents of these communities and how they created systems of mutual support. You know, so you know how to do electrical wiring and you know how to grow food, and now we've got a community. Now we can make it through anything. They would sort of piece things together, you know, skills with a community with complementary skills.
And when you say the separation between the dread merchants and the communities, did you see the dread merchants themselves also as survivalists, or like, can you talk a little bit more about that dynamic?
Yes, in the sense that if you didn't have tendencies to prep, you never would have imagined building these communities. But a lot of them struck me as they worked in real estate. They were selling a very particular kind of real estate, and it's a real estate that is meant to alleviate anxiety about, you know, these fears that we have. And strangely, I think it was effective in many cases. You know, once people had made the investment and started building their bunkers, they did feel a sense of peace, that they had put the money in the right place. But the dread merchants themselves, many of them were millionaires many times over, and many of them also had left space for themselves in the communities they built. So, you know, why would you do that unless you believed that, unless you believed in what you were selling? I mean, I think there was an aspect of that.
So you're saying they did believe, like, because you're describing something that could be seen as predatory, but.
And I think that was the case in some cases, but you know, it's hard to cleave, right? I mean, if someone is a really good salesman or salesperson, they're going to give you that pitch, right? And mm-hmm. if they're convincing, you're going to believe it. So that's the kind of second veil. You know, the first one is trying to get access to these communities, which, as Paige mentioned, is really difficult. But the second one is trying to punch through the garbage. And there was one community that I went to in Texas where the CEO ended up being arrested by the FBI. I'm giving away a big part of the book, but I'm just going to tell it anyway. So they were building this kind of multi-million-dollar doomsday community, and it turned out that he had taken money from what he thought was a Colombian drug cartel and laundered it through the community. And it was a sting operation, and the FBI descended on the community, and he's now in federal prison for a very long time. So there is an aspect of that, right? I mean, the more the world feels to people like it's going in a direction they're not comfortable with, the more there's an opportunity for predatory doomsday real estate entrepreneurship. I don't know what to call it. It's just kind of.
Yeah. I mean, you wrote that one of the most sobering moments was that when you were at PrepperCon, you saw bulletproof backpacks for children for sale. Can you tell me about that experience?
Yeah, I went to this. This was obviously pre-pandemic. I think it was 2018. I went there, but there was a convention with about 10,000 people. People selling all sorts of things, naturalist products, organic foods, colloidal silver, EMP proof solar panels. And, it was all kind of entertaining. I mean, there were even vehicles. There was a group of Mormons from Ogden, Utah, that were building these incredible, like 6-wheel drive RVs that were bulletproof that you could sleep in and live out of. But yeah, I ran across this booth where people were creating backpacks for children that could be turned around and double as shields. They were bulletproof backpacks, and it was just such a grim commentary on the state of society. It was depressing to imagine that we were going to build those things. And then I spoke to another person who worked in construction at that conference, and he said that the school shootings were a fantastic opportunity for new construction in creating shooter-proof schools. And that obviously, I mean, that was part of what fed my idea of the architecture of dread. When you build a new school, and part of your planning process is, how do we stop an active shooter? Do we put bunkers in classrooms, which has happened in Oklahoma? Do we make the front desks bulletproof? Do we give the kids bulletproof shields? I mean, it's when there's a market for that, it's a clear indication of a decline of a society. And instead of addressing the root causes of those issues, people are thinking about how to profit off of it, which is, it's really disturbing.
I think that quick, like, sort of going from like maybe like goofy to like terrifying is something that I find really disturbing about sort of like the prepper community, or the discourse around prepping. I guess this is a weird like segue, but I do think that the following clip from Tim Ralston's show sort of shows, it's also kind of goofy, but it does show like just that there's this like underlying violence to a lot of what we're talking about.
I think every American household should have a gun. Never have enough guns, never enough ammo.
As a prepper, Tim knows that at any moment, the unexpected can happen.
What happened? Whew. What happened?
Damn thing just misfired on it.
Get a truck up and ready. He's got to go to the hospital.
Yeah, okay.
Tim? All right. Tim, look at me.
So obviously that's like an extremely dramatic thing that Tim shot himself in the finger and then passed out. I mean, Paige, I wonder, how do you remember that happening?
Yeah, I remember because I was on the phone. I wasn't in the desert with them. I was on the phone with our field producer who was with him, who actually shows up in that clip, just trying to figure out what's happening. And yeah, I mean, Tim, they were out with the kids doing shooting practice, and it's kind of unclear because they were changing lenses on the camera, what exactly happened. But he shot his finger and then he went into shock. And luckily we have an EMT on site, and they had to helicopter him out of the desert. And then they had to reconstruct his thumb because he kind of like lost the top part of it. So they had kind of connected the top part to the base, the stump of the thumb. So he had, next time we saw him, he came by the offices with a new thumb.
Oh my, it's surreal. It's like, it's such a surreal thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And Tim went on to go to prepper conventions. I mean, he was still selling the Crowball. Despite that trauma, many people knew him as the guy who had shot his finger on doomsday preppers, but he kept going.
Like, yeah, it probably helped him sell the Crowball. that he became famous
Maybe.
for like having this like really dramatic moment on the show.
Mm-hmm.
That's so, yeah. And I mean, like for you, Paige, doing the show, like you said some people were like, what was the emotional, how did it feel emotionally to produce that show?
Well, I think at the time, because it was a little while ago, and I mean, I was younger, and I also think culturally we hadn't, addressed some things in our country in terms of, or fully faced them in terms of gun violence and whatnot. So to me, it just felt like kind of a wild ride, and it felt kind of quirky and fun. And I think like someone like Tim Ralston is a responsible gun owner despite that accident. But I also, looking back, think that looking at some of the stuff does remind me that there is like a malignancy and a malignant stripe to some of this. And a lot of it comes down to, I think, weaponry and guns and violence as, I say there's like two kinds of preppers that I met a lot. One is like the sort of burdened hero who sees the future and needs to tell everyone, like, get prepared. And one is kind of the guy who's like, don't come to my house or I'm going to shoot you. And that other kind, I think, looking back, is a little scarier when viewed through a 2021 lens.
That's an interesting dichotomy. Brad, did you also find that when you were doing your research?
Yeah, there were times during my research that I was extremely uncomfortable in some of the places that I was, and there were clearly people who were dealing with deep-seated issues that were manifesting in ways that will make other people uncomfortable. But I also found a lot of those people who were practical, people who were hopeful. I mean, I keep coming back to the idea of diversity, but I really did meet a lot of people who surprised me with their peace and perseverance and dedication to the craft. And they did think about it like that, growing things, making things, fixing things, building things. I learned so much hanging out with them, so much. And I didn't really expect that. I went into it similar to Paige, thinking, well, this is going to be quirky and interesting, and I'll be able to, I mean, I'm a geographer, so I thought this is a great story about space and how people interact with space and what people are building. And actually I came away with, some personal stories that actually affected me quite deeply. People who were very concerned about the state of society and the safety of their community, and I learned skills that I still use every day.
Like what?
So I learned how to do electrical wiring. I learned how to shoot all sorts of guns. I didn't shoot my fingers off. I learned how to work on this truck that I've got now. I've been growing food as well. I also had a vegetable tragedy when I tried to grow pumpkins last year, and then we had a freeze and all the vines went translucent overnight, and it was so devastating. So
it makes you appreciate the food ways. Like I had a moment where I was like, I'm glad I'm not depending on myself, because there wouldn't be tomatoes. Yeah.
Exactly. And then you have, when you grow food, I mean, this is a great example. You grow food and then you have such a I don't know, you feel so much reverence for what is in the grocery store. You go there but also kind of horror. Like, why is all this here? Why can I buy strawberries in the middle of winter? This isn't right, Mm-hmm. But you also start thinking through, like, if I weren't able to go to the grocery store, what would I do? And we all had a little taste of that at the beginning of COVID, right? Where like the toilet paper and the water and the pasta started disappearing. And we started to feel like, well, what if this keeps going? What if the fresh food disappears? I remember going into the grocery store in LA at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was like all the bananas were gone, and seeing the empty rack was kind of horrifying. Like, why bananas? Why did everyone grab those? It causes you to question the kind of infrastructure of life.
When I saw sorry to cut you off, Brad, but I just remember when I first saw that, I kind of had, I had a little flashback to my Doomsday Preppers days, where I remember one of our preppers telling us, you're 4 meals away from anarchy.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay, well, these that's kind of scary.
But it makes sense as to why people were hoarding things at the time, right? Because again, this is a natural psychological response to, and we're, this is happening at the moment, right? Fuel shortages in the American South, and people are running out and filling up every tank they have because, of course, like if you don't have faith that this system that we built, which is very intricate and complicated, is going to hold together in roughly the same way it has for so many years, then it makes sense that you would stockpile, that you would hoard, that you would hold things back. It doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't share them, but it does mean that you might grab them when you know you can. But the mistake most people make is they grab things in the midst of a disaster. I just bought a backup generator that runs on propane, so I can pull the propane tank off my barbecue and fire up the generator. And I bought it now because I know that the fires are coming in a couple of months. Because if I try to buy the generator then, I might not get it. Right.
Right. I mean, one of the things I was during working on Norco, I wanted to talk more about prepping, especially because we were in the midst of the pandemic, and it was just such an interesting question, like how did COVID impact the prepping community? So I'm curious, Brad, what did you notice? How did the community react?
Well, okay, so slightly disturbingly, a lot of the preppers that I was in contact with retreated to their bunkers, as I expected. And I called them and said, what's the plan here? And they said, this doesn't seem like a huge problem, but we've got the resources to deal with it. So we're just going to hang out for a couple of weeks and see how it pans out, right? So there was one community in South Dakota called the X Point. This is an incredible place. There's 575 concrete bunkers. They were built during World War II to store munitions. And now it's home to about 50 or 60 families. And they retreated into their bunkers, and after 14 days were able to emerge inside their own bubble that they had created, right? Like everyone had self-isolated. They didn't need to go out to get groceries. They started growing food, and they were anticipating something much worse than what happened. And that sounds callous now, given how many people have died and how much, tragedy this pandemic has produced. But they were prepared for something much worse. And many of them, so like 2 weeks into this, I'm scrambling to find bottled water and pasta, and they're like having a barbecue with 40 people outside with no masks. It was kind of weird to watch. And I'm like zooming in. I'm like, how are you guys doing? They're like, we're fine. What, do you want to come to the bunker community? And I said, I can't, because I've got family members that need my help. I can't retreat. But most of them, after about a month, they left. They went home because, and they went home happily, saying, this isn't the disaster we built the bunker for. Right?
That's
it was a night.
Really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, like it was a good insurance policy, but the fatality rate was not 10%, it was 1. So we're going home, and we can manage this on a day-to-day. Again, it kind of like, it was kind of horrifying, but it also gave me a little bit of hope. Like, okay, well, if they're feeling like this is a manageable crisis, it probably is. And they did tell me, this isn't the moment to pull the trigger. Other bunkers that were sort of like more elaborate, multi-million-dollar bunkers, they never even asked people to retreat to them. They said, this isn't what we're waiting for. Don't worry about it.
This isn't what is the term? When shit hits the fan?
Well, it did. I mean, and there's another term, the end of the world as we know it, Teotwaki, which Paige ran into, I'm sure. But and this was the end of the world as we know it. I mean, the world that we're emerging into now, as we all get vaccinated, is going to be a different world. We're experiencing it right now.
Yeah.
But what does it look like?
It sounds like
we
it
don't
didn't,
know.
but it sounds like it didn't have a major impact, which I think is interesting. Like, it doesn't sound like they're like, oh, we're just right on track, like we were gonna be doing. We're wrapping up, so I did want to end with Paige, what was your reflection after working on the show? Like, what did you feel like you had a big takeaway after producing that for a couple of years?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I kind of like hear it when Brad's talking too. Like, I feel like very protective a little bit of some of the people that I met, because I do feel in many ways they could be viewed as crazy or dangerous in some way that I did not find. I found the vast majority of them to be extraordinarily gracious and to be displaying sort of qualities that are like very, like good American qualities, such as, self-sufficiency and independence and kind of that stuff. I do think one thing I do think back on, and I think we did not go into the show and was a little naive, is that there is another stripe of sort of the sort of maybe closer to survivalist than prepper, I would say, that maybe doesn't have communal best interest at heart. And I think sometimes I'm glad that I met the other side of the prepper community rather than the more antisocial end of the world, and it's just me and my stuff people.
Yeah. And then I just one final last question, like so we're in the future, but like, what does the future of prepping look like? Will it physically be the same? Is it bunkers? Will it be different? I'm curious, Brad, if you saw like a different model.
So I've been in touch with a researcher at Cornell University, Chris Ellis, who does all of the quantitative work that I hate, crunching numbers. And he's been going over FEMA data about preparedness. And he emailed me 2 days ago and told me that recent FEMA data indicates that more than 13 million Americans are prepared to survive for 30 days without food, water, or infrastructure of any kind, which absolutely shocks me. So I feel like we're turning a corner in the sense that, we're prepping, as Paige said, it might have been seen as kooky or strange or weird or elite. It might have required a lot of money or time or effort. I think we're seeing a lot more people now working through prepping on a more practical level, installing solar panels, stockpiling a bit of food, getting off the grid, and that it's kind of dovetailing with our desire to become more sustainable in the context of climate change. So I feel like the future of prepping is self-sufficiency, but it's self-sufficiency in the name of community, right? Like we're all going to do better the more people can take care of themselves. One of the preppers told me at some point that it's like when you're on the airplane and they tell you to put the oxygen mask on yourself before someone else, right? Like you have to make sure that you're okay, and then you can go and help other people. And I think, it's a hopeful message, but I feel like that's where we're headed.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was really fun. I really enjoyed watching more clips from the show. And I think, I love that we were able to talk more about more recent prepping history and information. So thanks for joining me. And thank you so much, all the guests, for coming to the panel. I'm very appreciative that we're still able to keep the Norco story going.
Thank you very much for having us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.